Thank you for listening to Gooston's Bible Time. Today's sponsor is Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Tonight's topic is going to be functional atheism, which includes things such as pragmatism, consequentialism, utilitarianism, and hedonism. I hope I said those right. I'm not too great with the big philosophy words. Good. Well, as always, Josh is going to be leading us through tonight. So he's gonna pray for us, getting the meat and potatoes of everything. So you can take it away whenever, Josh.
All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you for giving us this time to reflect on the futility of a life without you and without regarding you and your word. Help us to root out such futility in every area of our thinking and our lives. Amen. All right, so the title, Functional Atheism, is not to imply that atheism is any way functional. Rather, I was trying to avoid using the word practical. But either way, it still ends up kind of wonky. So let me explain. What I mean by functional atheism is that you don't necessarily need to affirm atheism proper, that there is no God, in order to have adopted some of the viewpoints that we're going to examine tonight. In fact, these are primarily, with the exception of pragmatism, ethical systems that arose in the metaphysical vacuum of mostly American philosophy of the late 1800s and early 1900s. Then they were introduced to the public schools through the university-trained teachers, and within 2 to 3 generations, throw in some world wars in there to make everyone real jaded about everything. And suddenly you have people thinking in this kind of way almost automatically it became sort of the zeitgeist of that time period, and still is in many ways to this day the default moral structures that people work in apart from a Christian one. So the likelihood of you being taught to think this way are pretty good. This kind of ethical philosophy is utilized by Christians in areas where they think their Christianity either doesn't apply or doesn't have answers. So, as I go through these tonight, it's time for some self-examination. We've been bullying the atheists for a while. Let's look at ourselves for a moment. Ask yourself, do I think this way or in any of these ways in areas of my life? Do I think through what I ought to do in certain situations using these kinds of ethical perspectives? And a lot of people don't have a well thought out ethical system in their head necessarily, which is why we need to have one. Otherwise, you will default to one that you were taught or learned through observation of others. And that is a recipe for disaster. So we need to remember Christ has authority over every area of our thinking, as we explained at the very beginning of this Apologetics series, including the ethical areas of our thought. That means our moral thinking regarding what we ought to do, how we ought to live, has to be governed by Christ through his word in every area. So the following ethical systems, they again arose in primarily atheistic contexts, and they tend to abhor or ignore questions of metaphysics. And we've talked about metaphysics before. Metaphysics is the area of philosophical study that deals with what is, the reality around us. What does it consist of? Whereas epistemology, which we looked at, deals with what we know and how we know reality. So metaphysics answers the question of is, epistemology is the how do we know what is, and ethics is how should we live in the world that is and according to the knowledge we have. So these things are interrelated and interconnected disciplines. However, if you don't interconnect them properly or at all, you end up with bankrupt worldviews for sure. If you don't submit all of them to Christ, you definitely end up with a bankrupt worldview. So these viewpoints we're looking at are mostly dealing with ethics, and they don't like questions of metaphysics, what there is. And this leads us to the first critique we have. Yes, before I even explain what these are, I'm going to critique it. And the reason is because this is a very important philosophical problem that can be wielded by the Christian as a sword against many of the pagan worldviews out there and the non-Christian worldviews, because they can't deal with it properly. And it's an ethical problem and a metaphysical one. And it's called the ought-is problem, or the is-ought, however you would like to formulate that. Is-ought is probably the best way. That every one of these worldviews at bottom are arbitrary. Why? Because they are trying to derive what we ought to do, how we ought to live. And it's not just suggestions. It's not just, hey, this might be a good idea. It's you should. You have an obligation, a moral obligation, that it is really and actually good for you to live according to whatever perspective we're looking at. But the problem is that you cannot derive an ought, what you ought to do, from an is that cannot support it. So what's the is? Well, if it's atheism, then atheism cannot support any kind of oughts. It can't. There is no objective, knowable standards outside of the individual or the collective within an atheistic universe. And so the first thing they run into is the ought is or is ought problem. You can't derive your oughts from your ises if the is cannot properly give an account for the ought. Most of these are deriving their oughts from observation. Well, most people seem to behave this way. Therefore, all people should behave this way. And you should behave this way more often, or something along those lines. That's how they attempt to derive their oughts from that is, and that doesn't fly. You can't do it. There's no reason for me to agree with them or to be convinced by their argument if it's just, well, lots of people do this, so I guess you should too. Well, that's a logical fallacy and a half. And so really, it's arbitrary. It's not grounded properly on any kind of objective principles. So it ultimately, the oughts, the how you should live, are determined by the individual and then applied to everyone as a whole. Or if not applied to everyone, if they say, well, it's not actually an ought. It's really just, I think it would be better if everyone lived this way. Well, better implies something about the world. And we'll talk about that later. But so that can be challenged. But if they soften it to, it should be better if it would be better if everyone lived this way, then it's really just a matter of taste, of personal preference. And it's not really a matter of ethics. It doesn't matter if we listen to them or not. Why should we? They're Joe Schmo philosopher from down the road. Why should we pay any attention to what they have to say and how they want me or us to live? What authority do they have to declare what is right and wrong? Well, I've observed that lots of people seem to be happier when they live this way than this way. But what if it doesn't make me happy? Why should I listen to you? Again, it comes down then to individualistic preference. So we don't want that either. There are problems there. So that's my initial prefacing critique, and we'll return to that subject at the very end. But to the views we go. The first, pragmatism, is more of a theory of truth than an ethical philosophy, and is used to justify the other ones. So this is the primary way by which someone, if you began to challenge the following three views, they will probably explain it in pragmatic terms. Now, that word is a pretty common one, but it's actually a philosophical tradition, mostly found within American philosophy. It's the only philosophical field that America is known for developing, and it seems to go along well and good with the general American spirit, at least from the era in which it developed, which was during the Industrial Revolution and onwards. So in pragmatism, the truth is determined by whatever works. The truth is determined by whatever works. So for example, let's revisit Alvin Plantinga. I mentioned him in the first rundown of atheism that we did when we covered evolutionary naturalism. And I gave his example of Paul the hominid. And this is the guy who sees tigers whenever he needs to run away from things, even if there are no tigers there. And we used it then to critique evolutionary naturalism as being false because it's inconsistent with itself. Why on evolution would he be able to trust his sensory experience, and yet you are establishing evolutionary naturalism based on your sensory experience of the world? So there's no, but I don't have a reason, if it's true, to trust my sense experience, because I may have evolved to see tigers where they aren't there. For the pragmatist, this isn't a problem. The truth is determined by whatever works. As far as he's concerned, the tiger is there. It has produced the intended result, namely that Paul will run away in fear. So it doesn't matter whether his belief actually corresponds to the world. And it also doesn't matter if it even coheres in a consistent way with his other beliefs. And those are the two most popular theories of truth, are correspondence and coherence. And there's truth in both of those. When they're brought together in the right way, it's what the Bible teaches about truth. That a belief you have is only true if it corresponds to the world, and it also needs to be consistent with the rest of the things you believe. That's more of a moral issue, but I digress. For the pragmatist, the tiger doesn't need to be there. Paul just needs to run. And whatever danger he's escaping from, as long as the belief that he is forming works, then we're good to go. It doesn't matter. So, what's the critique of this? Well, primarily, we have to ask, what does it mean for something to work? What does it mean for a belief to function properly? That's what the pragmatist is concerned with. As long as the belief functions according to its purpose. An example that I read earlier today was about astrology. Well, back then, astrology and astronomy were the same thing, but because everything was all very religious inherently, but different understandings of the stars, as long as they let you sail your ship properly. Who cares whether you're right about whether the stars are, gods and goddesses, or if they are fiery balls of gas? It doesn't matter whether you're right about that. For the pragmatist, it only matters that your understanding of the stars gets you to the right place you're trying to go. So, what does it mean for something to work, for a belief to work? Well, the idea itself implies what's called a telos, a purpose, a goal, an end toward which our beliefs are tending or taking us. And this is, notably, a metaphysical idea. It's trying to talk about the way the world is. that we have some kind of genuine objective goal and meaning and purpose outside of us that our beliefs need to function to get us to. Now, why does it have to be outside of us? Well, otherwise, the pragmatist is stuck in a radical subjectivism that he can't escape. That's so radical that it that the very he ends up in a deadly loop of my beliefs only they're true if they work. But my belief about that also just needs to work to be true. So his own belief in pragmatism, if it is also just pragmatic, means that it's not true. That the belief that beliefs are true if they work, that has to work for it to be true. And it doesn't, one. But two, how do you determine if it's working? How do you find that out? That there's no way to actually examine this thing, and it falls apart on its own 2 feet. So that idea that what does it mean for something to work? That there's a metaphysical implication here. That there needs to be some kind of external telos to us in order to actually get pragmatism off the ground. You have to have some kind of metaphysics, and the pragmatists don't want to talk about it at the least, and at the most, they just have some really funny and crazy answers to it. A lot of them are evolutionary naturalists. There's no telos in evolutionary naturalism. There's no design. There's no purpose or end toward which we are working toward, unless it's the propagation of the species. And we've talked about all kinds of problems that you get into with that in the past. So let's look at these 3 moral ethical philosophies. And these are ways that people try to answer the question, what is the right thing to do? What ought I to do in any given situation? The first we're looking at is consequentialism. For the consequentialists, the right thing to do is determined by the consequences, either the least bad consequence or the most positive consequence is the highest good or the right thing to do in any given situation. Now, at first, this might seem pretty reasonable. Nobody wants bad things to happen. So they might think through the pros and the cons. I mean, we're taught to do this in school, at least I was. Think through the pros and cons of any given action. And if you have more, the pros outweigh the cons, if the good consequences outweigh the bad, then do the thing. And it seems at the surface pretty reasonable. And the tricky thing about a lot of these is that there's always a bit of truth mixed in. So that's not an unfair way to reason in areas of life in which God gives us freedom to make those kinds of considerations. For example, the Bible doesn't tell you which university to go to. At least it narrows the field a bit. You shouldn't go to one in which, they're going to just try to brainwash you with this kind of garbage the whole time. And you shouldn't go to one in which you'll be constantly tempted to sin, and you shouldn't, we can exclude some things based on what the Bible teaches. But if we have equally good options before us, if I've got 2 universities that both have good academics, good study, they teach from a Christian worldview, I can go and learn how to do the trade I want to learn how to perform, or the area I would like to study from them, and they're both pretty reasonably, priced or whatever. Then making a pros and cons list and considering the consequences. Maybe one is farther away from where I live, one's closer to home. I could be near family, or maybe I could be away from family, and maybe that's something that I should do. That's okay in those kinds of circumstances. However, when you make this your ultimate controlling moral philosophy, you end up in a bad place. And people do this in areas that are explicitly moral and ethical in nature. They're not these kinds of more just, well, there's not a good or bad thing to do here. I've got multiple good options that I've already determined are good ones based upon my Christian worldview. Rather, at the start of it, they would have started considering the consequences at the beginning. Their pros and cons lists are their moral directive. They didn't even think about, would going here honor and glorify God, and would I be able to obey him well here or not? Or am I going to get brainwashed with lies here? Like that wasn't in their moral calculus. Rather, it was simply, what are the consequences of my action? Which one leads to the most positive results and which one leads to the most negative consequences? And then I'll just do the one that has the most positive results. People use this all the time in the political sphere. For example, uh, a common form of argumentation is, well, the lesser of two evils. This is a consequentialist argument. You may have heard that, especially when it comes to voting, but people use it in all kinds of other areas of life. Well, I have to choose between these things. I will take the lesser of two evils, the least bad of the consequences. Nowhere can you find in the Bible a approach to ethics that says, well, I guess if you have to be evil, just be less evil than the other option. That's not how it works. Disobedience to God is never the route to take, whatever it may be. So, when you use that in areas where you are doing a moral calculus based on the consequences before you've considered what God's word has to say about things, then you've started off in the wrong foot. Now, this one is not the most popular in terms of people holding to it explicitly, but many people, again, reason in this way about lots of things. And again, it's not a completely inherently bad form of reasoning in areas where it is appropriate to consider the consequences of our actions. However, as an ultimate form of moral philosophy, a moral framework, it cannot sustain itself in any way. So what do I mean there? How do we the number one question for the consequentialist is, how do we accurately predict the consequences of our actions, and how far out do I need to trace the consequences before I make a decision? Here's an example from the Bible. Joseph, when he was in Egypt, he could have passed down all the food he saved to everyone right away. If he had believed that the famine was only going to last a year, then for the consequentialist, that would have been the best thing to do. Pass out all that food, feed everybody as much as you can, because the famine's going to be over soon. However, he knew the famine was going to last longer, so he slowly distributed the food. But if I was a consequentialist and didn't have the knowledge that Joseph did, thought, well, but what if it lasts longer? Well, then I need to ration things, but I don't know how long it will last. So how far out do I need to think here? Should I think 10, 20 years? And this is what many people are doing, for example, with the COVID stuff. They're doing consequentialist moral calculus, trying to figure out what the best thing to do is. And that's not how we need to start. We need to think through, does God's word have anything to say about how we should handle these kinds of situations? It does. And we need to do that thing first and foremost. And then if it gives us freedom to consider the outcomes of our actions and the pros and cons of a situation, then we can talk about that. But if we start there, which is what many people are doing, you end up in a bad place because you are determining individually what the good and bad consequences are. You might be of the mindset, for example, that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And that a good consequence, even if it involves the death of a few, would be to save the lives of many people, and even actively killing a few people, for example. This kind of reasoning is used and condemned, ironically condemned, in John's Gospel when he gives us a peek into the Pharisee huddle meeting, and the one of the leaders of the Pharisees says, "Hey, well, isn't it better for one man to die for the nation than for the nation to perish?" That's a consequentialist moral thought process. Well, it's much better for one guy to die here than for everybody to go down. No, what's better is to obey God. What's better is to obey God. Now, John points out the irony of what he says, that Jesus is actually dying for a nation of people, a holy nation, a people far more expansive than that guy could have imagined. And he is going to save them. So John points out the irony of his statement. However, it's clear that, well, his actions are condemned. His thought process is condemned in thinking, oh, hey, you know what? A good thing to do here would be, let's kill a guy, an innocent guy who's done nothing wrong. Let's kill him, murder him, cold blood, just so that we can avoid the scrutiny of the Romans. So the consequentialist ethic is soundly condemned. The next we move to is hedonism. Hedonism got its start with the ancient Greeks, big surprise there. And the basic principle behind it is that the greatest good, the thing you ought to do, is whatever brings you the most pleasure. That's it. It's that straightforward. Whatever brings you the most happiness or pleasure, do that thing. Don't have to think harder than that about it. Just do whatever you want to do. Whatever will bring you happiness in the moment, do it. And that's the kind of embryonic version of hedonism. A fellow named Epicurus, Greek philosopher, comes along a little bit later and tries to nuance it a little bit. And he argues that long-term pleasure and happiness is greater than short-term pleasure and happiness. So you may have to do things that you don't like in the short term, like work hard or suffer pain, for example, in exercising, in order to acquire long-term happiness, like a healthy body or a good paycheck or whatever. So Epicurus tries to nuance it a bit, and that's pretty much how hedonism has survived in its base form is do what you want, do what pleases you, do what makes you happy, and that's all you have to think about. Just follow your heart, whatever your heart wants, just do that thing. Now, the critique is, well, actually in the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes directly confronts and critiques hedonism. Because, as the author of Ecclesiastes points out, he tried it. He gave it a whirl. Anything that he saw that his eyes desired, he laid his hand to and acquired it. And at the end of the day, it all meant nothing. And he hated what he had done. And it was pointless and meaningless. So, the Bible roundly condemns it, but what's a internal critique? Well, the internal critique of hedonism is that pleasure is subjective. Happiness is subjective at least within their worldview. Remember, this is an internal critique. I don't think that pleasure and happiness are universally subjective. There are certain things that are subjective, like I might like a certain kind of ice cream or a certain kind of movie genre that someone else doesn't. But we're talking about a big moral picture here. What's the right thing to do? Well, the thing that's going to make you happy. Well, the Greeks didn't think this one through very well. The serial killer really likes killing people. It makes him real happy. He gets all of his jollies out, just stabbing people in the face. That is intuitively repulsive, biblically wrong, obviously. But even on a lesser level, there are also distinct kinds of pleasure. Are we talking about the pleasure of the mind, of the body, of just emotional happiness? What kind of pleasure are we talking about? The hedonist doesn't like to answer those questions because as soon as they have to get very specific, everything begins to fall apart. So if someone says just do whatever makes you happy, it's like, well, How do I know what's going to make me happy before I do it? How do I know? I might think this is going to make me happy. Again, how far out do I need to play this thing into the future as well? Even for Epicurus, like the long-term pleasure is greater than the short-term, but am I, what if at the end of the road it doesn't make me happy, like the author of Ecclesiastes points out? He bought into the long-term pleasure game, got near the end of his life, and said it was all meaningless. It was pointless. Rich people kill themselves. Why? They spend most of their lives gathering things that they think will make them happy, and they find out that it doesn't. It's, a generalization. It's not the only reason they do. But that's a possible reason, certainly has proven to be at least one. So there's hedonism. Now, some of the critiques I just made of hedonism are not as clear, or at least don't apply as clearly to the next one. And this is the most common one in our day. And this is one that a lot of people live by, especially if they're not Christians. And this is utilitarianism. This is the sophisticated, two-headed child of hedonism and consequentialism, which is why I saved it for last. And utilitarianism, which was popularized by a couple of philosophers, uh, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, kind of are the first to really write a lot on utilitarianism and coin the word and kind of get it off the ground. But people have developed it over the last century and a half or so. In utilitarianism, the right thing to do is whatever produces the most utility. The immediate problem for the utilitarian, then, is going to be defining utility. And that differs among utilitarians. The general approach that many take is that utility is happiness or pleasure. So they agree with the hedonists there, but not on an individual level. So they avoid the serial killer critique by saying that it is happiness on a societal level. So for the utilitarian, the right thing to do is whatever produces the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. And so that's how they try to avoid things like anarchy and just following your whims to whatever you would like to go to. So a simple axiom they will use is do no harm. If you hear that phrase, do no harm, as a moral axiom, it is coming from a utilitarian perspective, probably. So for the utilitarian, as long as you aren't hurting anyone, do whatever you want. Because the principle, do no harm, produces the most happiness for the most people. Now, what's wrong with this? Should we, as Christians, care about what other people do for fun or for their pleasure or happiness? As long as they aren't harming anyone, why should we care about it? Well, we should. Why? Because sin never stays in a corner. If what they're calling fun and what they're doing is for their happiness, supposedly, if it's what God calls evil and wickedness, then we have a great concern with them doing it. In fact, even within their own ethic, what they're doing is wrong because it's harming themselves. They are doing harm. They're doing harm to themselves. They're finding it pleasurable in the moment, or maybe they're striving to acquire some long-term thing that they think will please them. But if what they're doing is engaging in what is called evil by God, what he has determined in his word, made clear the difference between good and evil, right and wrong, then we do need to have a concern about them doing it. Even if it's a private sin, that private sins never stay private. They will always go public somehow in some manner. So that's our first kind of external Christian perspective looking at it. The internal critique is, again, the subjective nature of happiness and pleasure. The complexity of actually determining the calculus of happiness across a great number of people when they all have differing ideas of what's going to make them happy. Someone has to do that, and if a philosopher or, God forbid, the government decides that it's their prerogative to determine, to do the utilitarian calculus for all of the people in a society, well, it's not going to end well, because it's going to be whatever that government or that philosopher thinks is the highest happiness, the highest pleasure. They're going to say, well, we should all be pursuing that thing. We should all work together and do whatever we can to produce that utility in the world. And that's how you end up with despots, tyrants, totalitarian regimes, real quick. And they'll smile at you and say, we're doing it for your own good the whole way through. Utilitarianism is a pretty bad idea. And again, even on a fundamental level, the individual is arbitrating what is good, not just for themselves, but for other people. And they're still deciding what is harmful and what is not. And at bottom, in a diverse society of any kind where people disagree on those very important issues, the utilitarian calculus will fail, which is part of why there's a press from folks who hold to this kind of moral philosophy to get people to conform to their way of thinking, because it's the only way to increase the utility in this society. See, as many people solved it, if you have everyone thinking the same way, that we all agree that this is the highest good, then we can all work together easily to produce, that nobody's going to be bucking against us when we try to implement our highest utility forming plan, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. So that's utilitarianism in a nutshell, a very brief one. Now, most of the time, it's important to remember you find an amalgamation of these beliefs, not just one within someone's thinking. You'll find various kinds of hedonists and utilitarians and consequentialism in the world. And again, a lot of people have not thought these things through and don't have a complete moral framework. They have a default that they go to whenever they're presented with a moral problem. For the Christian, that default needs to be the Bible. It needs to be the Word of God. We need to go and study it when we have some kind of dilemma facing us, a moral question. Ideally, we are studying and reading the Word of God in such a way that our moral instincts are shaped by it. That's the way you want to be. That's called discipleship. And Jesus commands us to make disciples of the nations, teaching them to obey all that he commanded. Well, to do that, you've got to know what he commanded you, and then you can take it and apply it to very specific situations. And that's how we do ethics as Christians. We take the commands of God and we apply them to the specific situations of our lives. That's our ethical framework. But when we begin to introduce these kinds of beliefs into our moral thinking, we can end up in a bad spot, especially if we start with them as our starting point. It's no good. So, my critique of all of them, briefly. The foundation, none of these has a foundation to answer the teleological question. It attempts to derive an ought from an is, namely the ought that we should live for our own happiness, from the is that people generally do what makes them happy. So they observe that people, generally speaking, will do what makes them happy. Therefore, we should live for our own happiness. Well, that's one. It's not true that people generally do what makes them happy. You can find people who can't account for self-sacrifice, genuine sacrifice. And when I challenged a utilitarian this years ago, he just told me that there is no such thing as genuine sacrifice. And I was very happy to present to him the sacrifice of Jesus Christ in that moment. But yeah, for these worldviews, the subjective, individualistic nature of the ethical system is a problem. Each individual is the arbiter of what the good is, and therefore disagreement over what the good is on both an individual and societal level are inevitable. They're bound to occur. And there's no way of resolving this disagreement over how to answer this teleological question that's assumed in each of these worldviews. What is the good? What is happiness? What is pleasure? So if you can't resolve this disagreement, because again, for the pragmatist, all that matters when it comes to truth is not what is, but what works. So if you can't know what is, or you aren't bothering to try, then you can't resolve any disagreement. At that point, it becomes a power play. Whoever stronger gets to acquire their happiness at the expense of the weak. And we go right back to Nietzsche, where ethics are just a disguise for power grabs, which is what he taught and believed. So from the Christian perspective, how do we form our ethical frameworks? We have a God who has designed us with a specific telos, a specific purpose to glorify him. And he has informed us that our greatest good and happiness is found in him. Psalm 16:11 says, "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy, and at your right hand are pleasures forevermore." So we have an answer to the teleological question. God makes known to us, so it's revelatory. God speaks and makes known to us the path of life, the way that our lives are meant to ought to be lived out in his world. And part and parcel of that is that our highest joy, the fullness of joy, is found in his presence, at his right hand. So we can answer what the highest good is and what our purpose is as Christians. So we have an actual accounting for the telos, and we can derive an ought from the is. God is. He is the I am. He is isness. He is prime reality, because he has created us and designed us for a purpose, told us what that purpose is, commanded us in the way we should live. Then we ought to obey him because he is our God. He has created us. The divine law comes down to show us how our Creator has designed us to live. The commands don't come arbitrarily, but from the one who made us and designed us. So briefly, before I close everything out, this will end our discussions on atheism. Next, this will end our discussions on atheism. Next week, we will do some practical application with our good mutual friend, Andrew. And we'll have a bit of a run around and pretend to be atheists for a bit. And that'll be fun. But this will conclude the discussions on it. After next week, the week after that, we will begin looking at some other religions. And those, I promise, will not take 6 weeks. They will be much shorter. I will devote just one night to most of them. So, some concluding thoughts on atheism. This is an analogy I like to use. It might be helpful to some of you, maybe not others. But the atheists, they have all the Legos out of the box. They have the right world. They live in God's world. They're made in his image. They have all the Legos, all the parts to be able to come to the right conclusion. God's revelation is made clear. But they ditch the instruction manual and are just free-forming their own Lego creations. And as we've seen, all of those free-formed creations are internally inconsistent and cannot account for the world that God has made. So we see genuinely correct observations about the world, and sometimes they'll even end up at the right moral conclusions, like don't kill people, don't stab people in the face. Most atheists will agree with you that's a bad thing to do, but they can't give an account for any of it. They picked up their Lego pieces and they tried to make something without following the instructions and ended up making something terrible, and that in the end doesn't work. If they had read the instructions, it would have explained how it all fit together: creation, existence, thought, reason, science, whether God exists. All of it would have been abundantly clear to them if they had just picked up a book and read it. So, some concluding thoughts there. I like my little Lego analogy. It's one of my favorite ones I've come up with over the years. So, hope it's helpful. All right, let me pray, and then we'll open up some Q&A. God, thank you for giving us actual instructions, for giving a specific revelation of yourself and our fallenness, that our need for you to speak is because of our rebellion that we are born with, live in every day, this fallen nature. We needed you to speak, to make yourself known, to condescend to us. We are so grateful that you did. In grace and in mercy, you came near to us who are unworthy and needy, and have shown us the path of life through Jesus Christ, who is at your right hand, where there is fullness of joy and pleasure forevermore. Amen.
Amen. All right. Now it's the time for questions. If y'all have them, you can either type in the Bible study chat, or you can use your microphone, use your voice, your vocal cords. Just be mindful of other people trying to talk. Don't try to like yell over each other or anything like that, although that has never really happened before. I still like to just warn, I suppose. But yeah, now is the time for that.
Well, I know Winston has asked this question before, but it's been a while, and I've forgotten the answer, sadly. But it was, what was your opinion on? You may have heard John Piper's view on Christian hedonism, basically saying that God is most satisfied when God is most glorified when we are most satisfied in Him. What do you think of that, Josh, if I may ask?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. It's inevitable if you spend enough time in reformed and pseudo-reformed circles that you'll run across John Piper's Christian hedonism. And it's the general principle I can agree with. The way that Piper carries it out can often be unhelpful or confusing or just downright wrong. And I'll explain it. Let me give an example, but let me explain what Christian hedonism is for those who don't know. As Larry just said, the short summary sentence is that he takes a sentence from the Westminster Confession of Faith, that God is the most, or rather, that the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And by end, that's that word we were talking about earlier, the telos, the purpose, the chief purpose of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Well, he takes the and turns it into a by, and says that the chief end of man is to glorify God by enjoying Him forever. And he has a very, very long book called The Pleasures of God, in which he sets down a very carefully thought through case for this by rooting it in the pleasure that God takes within Himself amongst members of the Trinity. And I love that book, and I thought that was a great book. The way that he makes application of this to people's lives, though, can be a bit confusing for some people. Piper seems like an emotional guy from listening to many of his sermons. And he often will center Christian realities around the emotions. So I've heard him say things, I don't want to quote it directly, but it's similar to this. Here's the gist of it. Because I can't remember, it's been a long time since I listened to the sermon in question, but basically that if you do not find yourself with a genuine and strong emotional affection for Jesus, then you should question whether you are a Christian. Now, there may be some people who need to hear that. There are other people who feel things a little differently than Piper does. And I think part of the problem is that he universalizes the way he expresses and experiences his own emotional life to everyone. And that is the part that I find troubling. It's not so much the general principle. I think absolutely, we should be finding our joy, and our emotional life should be centered on God. Our affection should be geared toward Him. But I don't think that if we find our affections running cold, that we necessarily need to just jump to the conclusion, I'm not a Christian. Nor should we center our evaluation of whether we're a Christian on anything in ourselves necessarily. What I mean is that the assurance of your salvation lies outside of you. If you navel gaze hard enough into the abyss of your soul, you will always find things that, according to your standards, will be unsatisfactory as to whether you think you're a Christian or not. Everyone at the end of the day, if they do enough self-examination, will conclude that they are not a Christian. Whether we're a Christian, it's why the justification by faith is so beautiful, and the gospel gives us so much hope, is that the reality of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is what secures your place in the kingdom. And it is important to recognize that while some people, through self-examination, will find that they aren't Christians. I mean, that's what happened to me. Was that, okay, I don't think I'm a Christian, even though I had grown up in church and professed to be one. The litmus test can't be centered in the emotions alone. It's more complex than that. If you find yourself living in utter and complete abject rebellion against God, you have no concern for His word, no concern for Him, no concern for His commands, then there's a legitimate question to be raised. The affections are so much trickier to evaluate, which I think is why it doesn't say at any point in the Bible, examine your emotions to see whether you are in the faith. It says to examine yourself, and typically that's in light of, am I striving to be obedient to Christ? Am I striving to be a disciple, to bring my whole life into subjection to Jesus? And that does include the affections, but it's not limited there. And Piper often limits it there in the way that he speaks about it. So that's my hiccup on it. A long answer to a short question, but I hope that made sense.
That was great. Thanks.
And using the word hedonism confuses people, so you probably shouldn't have done that, but whatever.
Is there any other questions?
All right, so Winston asks, you said that the reason we shouldn't let people do things God says are wrong is because sin doesn't stay in a corner. So how does this interact with homosexuality? Well, yeah, so from an internal critique perspective, it's hurting them. Their do no harm principle doesn't apply there because sin does terrible things to you. So there's that. Whatever temporal happiness they think they're acquiring pales in comparison to the judgment of God, and then also the temporal consequences of sin are real. Whatever they may be, God does still judge people in the temporal space by bringing consequences for their sin into their lives. That did not go away with the New Testament. But I guess from a broader perspective, the question's more so asking, why should we not just leave the gay folks alone in their corner? If they want to go be gay in their corner, then it'll stay there. Well, we've seen very clearly it doesn't stay there. Just take a glance at, for example, remember what I said earlier, where anyone who follows these kinds of moral philosophies, if there's disagreement, it cannot be tolerated. because there's no way to adjudicate the disagreement. So everyone needs to be brought into conformity. It didn't stay in the corner. The earliest homosexual activists promised us it would stay in the corner. It hasn't, clearly. It's everywhere. And if you buck against it at all, you are slandered, condemned, canceled, etc. So, yeah. The easiest way to answer the question is take a look outside, or Twitter, I guess, which is thankfully not outside. The outside world is still quite beautiful. Any other questions?
Well, seems like there are no other questions. We can officially be done